calei meu choro pelo meu caminho, já toquei nas cordas, chorei. Eu também já calei meu choro. Eu também já chorei de amor. Chora.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet, Channel 628. 1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective. It's time for Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla. Stay tuned for insights, impact, and inspiration right here on Channel Africa. Available on the Channel Africa app.
And it's a very good evening to you. A warm welcome. This is Africa World Hour on the Wednesday edition of it here on Channel Africa, the African perspective. Thank you so much for joining us as we bring you an hour of the very latest news from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe. As we say, we bring you the voices, the faces, and the perspectives that matter, and your perspective matters as well. So please do reach out to us. Let us know what conversations you're having in your community, what is influencing the decisions that you are making. And of course, also do point out to us some of the stories that we're missing that you really think ought to be on the platform. +27 63 406 9126. That's the hotline number that you can reach out to us on. And remember, we are streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, and we are also on the socials at Channel Africa 1. Straight to our top stories this hour.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And we start with this. South Africa's Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition, Pax Dau, has confirmed that Pretoria remains eligible for the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. This as US President Donald Trump signs the Trade Preference Program into law. The reauthorized AGOA program has been extended one more year until the 31st of December this year. Dau was addressing the media on the sidelines of the Afrexim Bank accession signing ceremony in Johannesburg.
We, of course, know that there have been people that have been calling for an out-of-cycle review of South Africa's participation on the basis that, in fact, they would want to encourage a more bilateral engagement with South Africa. We continue to hold a different view about the need to extend AGOA. And yes, if you want to engage with South Africa on a bilateral basis, we do have an appetite to do that. And it's important because South Africa has been the leading country in utilizing AGOA, and there are critical value chains and supply chains that affect different countries in the participation in the AGOA programs.
Staying in South Africa, the country's International Relations and Corporations Minister Ronald Lamola has lambasted those criticizing action taken against the Israeli Deputy Ambassador to South Africa, Ariel Seidman. Lamola says DIRCO had a number of engagements last year with Seidman to try and express its views on the constant attacks that he directed towards President Cyril Ramaphosa and the government. He also indicated that Pretoria will not drop its International Court of Justice case.
We have not taken the decision lightly. It was after repeated misconduct by the charge d'affaires of the Israel embassy, who was called to DIRCO many times last year as a demarche to call the diplomat to order to behave in a manner that the guests and diplomats are supposed to behave through the protocols and the Vienna Convention, how it guides us.
Humanitarian organization the International Red Cross says the number of people killed by gunmen in Nigeria's Kwara state has risen to almost 70. This area is usually targeted by armed gangs. Several other people are still missing. The BBC's Mokwachi Okava has the details.
Armed gangs attacked the village of Woro in central Nigeria's Kwara State late on Tuesday, a local lawmaker said. The AFP news agency says the Red Cross has put the death toll at 67, making it the deadliest attack this year in the area near the Niger State border. Lawmaker Saidu Baba Ahmed told the BBC that gunmen set homes and shops on fire, forcing residents to flee into nearby bush.
Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi, has been confirmed dead after he was shot dead. The Office of Libya's Attorney General says investigators and forensic doctors examined Saif al-Islam's body and determined that he died from gunshot wounds. Saif was expected to run again in the upcoming presidential elections in Libya next month, as details of the shooting remain undisclosed. Senior researcher at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, Naim Jina, has more.
Before the uprising began in 2011, he was seen as a kind of reformist figure, although he very modestly used to say that he doesn't want to be his father's successor. But around the world, especially in the Western world, promoted himself with Western governments, etc., as reformists that could bring democracy and liberalism, etc., to Libya. After the uprising in 2011, he was seen by many people as basically being in his father's camp. And so the few Gaddafiotes that were left, in a sense, supported him, but not supported him as a kind of the future leader or anything like that.
Another round of U.S. brokered talks on ending the war in Ukraine has begun in Abu Dhabi. The two-day trilateral meetings come after President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia had exploited an U.S.-backed energy truce last week to stockpile munitions, attacking Ukraine with a record number of ballistic missiles. The BBC's Sasha Schlichter has the details.
Early on in the war, an emboldened Kremlin amended the constitution, claiming Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions were all Russian territory. Now officials mostly just mention Donetsk. But even there, Russia will struggle to take the last 20%, with the cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk having been turned into fortresses. So Moscow is probably bluffing when demanding Kiev hands it over. Few are holding their breath for a tangible result in Abu Dhabi. So if the talks fail, it'll be back to Russia's fallback option, bombing Ukraine's population into submission, cutting off heating to thousands of homes in the coldest days of winter.
And finally, the U.S. retail giant Walmart has become the first traditional retailer to get $1 trillion market valuation after a rise of 26% in its shares over a year. Its value now approaches that of big tech companies like Nvidia or Apple. The BBC's David Waddell reports.
Walmart was, for many years, the biggest retailer in the United States and the world, overtaking Sears in 1990. Today, one of its top competitors is Amazon. Its value much higher, but Walmart's sales are still far in excess of its online rival's retail trade. It's known for its dominance in the low-price market, recently luring in higher earners keen to mitigate high inflation in their weekly shop. While this trillion-dollar league is mainly big tech firms, Walmart's well on the way.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Now, at 8 minutes past 9, we continue with Africa World Hour. Monday saw the reopening of the Rafah crossing between the Gaza Strip and Egypt following last year's ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Despite this, the crossing has faced myriad challenges while also revealing scars of those who were affected. This comes after the crossing reopened 2 years after the border had been closed due to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But just to update the story, to let you know that today we saw the closing of that crossing, with Israel refusing to allow those needing urgent medical attention to cross into Gaza for treatment. Bonolo Maribe has this report.
The Rafah crossing, Gaza's sole route in and out for its 2 million plus residents, has been shut for most of the war. Few Palestinians were allowed back from Egypt, including 56-year-old Huda Abu Abed, who spent a year there for medical treatment. She recounted her harrowing return.
The army took me, blindfolded me, tied my hands. They took us somewhere and then they removed the blindfold from my eyes. He said, "Do you know where you are?" I said, "How would I know? Do you think I know where you have put me? What have I done for you to treat me like this?" He said, "Be quiet." So I was quiet.
Abu Abed also detailed further restrictions at the crossing.
The Palestinian Authority does not do anything at the crossing, nothing, except pulling things out of bags. They didn't leave anything with us. No medicine, no child's toys which we brought for our children, no phone, nothing. The tablet for the children, they took it. They didn't leave anything with us.
Challenges persist after patient evacuations halted on Wednesday at Rafah. Palestinian Red Crescent spokesperson Raid Al-Nims hopes that more people can be evacuated in the coming days.
We were at the utmost preparedness to evacuate the third batch of the ill and wounded from the headquarters of the Medical Rehabilitation Hospital for the Red Crescent in Khan Yunis. But unfortunately, we were informed of the postponement of this batch. Therefore, we are waiting for tomorrow to evacuate a third batch once again.
Since the reopening, at least 40 people have crossed from Egypt to Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel's military has denied that its forces mistreated returnees. Bonolo Maribe, SABC News.
Moving on now, South Africa has taken a major step in deepening its economic ties with the rest of the continent. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the country's accession to the African Export-Import Bank marks a strategic move to boost intra-African trade, industrial development and regional value chains. Speaking in Johannesburg at the signing of the Instrument of Accession on Wednesday, Ramaphosa described the partnership as both ambitious and timely, as Afrexim Bank pledged an $8 billion investment into South Africa's economy. Channel Africa's reporter Michael Mbewe has more.
The signing ceremony marks South Africa's formal transition to Class A shareholder status in Afrexim Bank and signals the activation of strategic partnership aimed at advancing industrial development, export-led growth, and deeper intra-Africa trade integration. In his remarks, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the signing represents an intentional, inclusive and ambitious step designed to deliver meaningful impact.
Today's signing signals a deliberate as well as an ambitious and more impactful phase in our country's economic engagement with our beloved African continent as well as the world. For South Africa, the decision to accede to Afrexim Bank represents a strategic alignment. We seek to contribute to an Africa that prioritizes intracontinental trade, that builds its own industrial base and capacity, and also mobilizes African financial institutions to support development.
Ramaphosa added that the partnership will boost South Africa's support for exporters, industrial projects and regional value chains at a time of both challenge and opportunity.
This partnership will strengthen in more ways than one South Africa's ability to support exporters, South African exporters that is, industrial projects and regional value chains while advancing our continent's development. South Africa accedes to Afrexim Bank at a time of both challenge, which at times makes people terrified, but it is also a time of great opportunity for our continent and indeed for our country as well.
Afrexim Bank President George Elombi announced an initial $8 billion funding package for South Africa, describing it as a deliberate and purposeful commitment, marking the country's full membership of the bank.
I'm therefore pleased, Your Excellency, that together with the South African Department of Trade and Industry, under the leadership of Honorable Minister Park Stow, we have put together with him and his colleagues what we consider an important package to signify that South Africa's complete membership of Afrexim Bank was intended, it was deliberate, it was purposeful. We have put together an important package of 8 billion United States dollars, an initial package of 8 billion United States dollars for South Africa.
He said the funding will focus on local processing of natural resources, mineral beneficiation, automotive manufacturing, and the expansion of industrial parks and special economic zones to boost jobs, revenue, and value retention in South Africa.
We intend to invest, to do very heavy investments in the local processing of natural resources, thereby helping retain value within our economies, create jobs, generate wealth for our people. For that's the ultimate objective. We intend to expand the revenue base for the South African fiscal authorities. In particular, we will prioritize mineral processing, the expansion of the automotive manufacturing and development, and the expansion of industrial parks and specialized zones.
Speaking virtually, Secretary General of African Continental Free Trade Area, Wamkele Mene, said South Africa's accession to Afreximbank sends a strong signal of commitment to African-led solutions, stressing that trade finance is critical to the success of continental integration under the AfCFTA.
This ceremony is therefore significant not just for South Africa and Afreximbank, it is also significant for the implementation of the AfCFTA. The success of the AfCFTA depends not only on market access, but also on the availability of trade finance to support production and trade-enabling infrastructure. Today's event sends a clear and powerful signal that Africa's leading economies are committed to African solutions by supporting and enabling African institutions to finance Africa's economic development and continental integration.
Michael Mbewe, Channel Africa News, Johannesburg.
And that brings the time to 16 minutes past 9. Human rights organizations in the Kingdom of Eswatini say they are studying a High Court ruling dismissing their case against the government's $5.1 million third country deportee deal with the United States. The case was filed by parties led by the Eswatini Litigation Center, who argued that the agreement was unconstitutional because as it was not submitted to Parliament for approval and its terms were not disclosed. Eswatini is one of several African countries that have made such secretive deals with the US to accept deportees deemed unwanted by their countries of origin. For more on what the ruling means, we are joined on the line by the Executive Director of the Swaziland Litigation Center, Mzwandile B. Masuku. A very good evening to you, Mr. Masuku. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just first start with the case itself when you filed it, just to take us through what you wanted the court to consider and the outcome now.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you and your viewers. Look, when we filed the application, it was because of the social media reports, of course, that we saw coming as far from as America around the deportees having been brought into the country and how they had been described, and the fact that these deportees were not welcomed by their own countries of origin. It is important to mention that it was stated that these deportees had also served their prison terms. Now, our government didn't disclose this to us. It was only social media. Of course, there was a huge uproar and outcry around how this could happen without the knowledge of Swazis and our parliament. And there were different angles to this question that we sought to deal with. The fact was the violation of the Constitution in that a unilateral decision is taken without consultation. But the other is the fact that you have persons brought from an entirely different continent and country to Swaziland. It seems they are not consulted around them being brought into the country. We are skeptical about the capacity of our country to handle individuals described in that manner. But we are also worried about the fact that how were they brought into the country? Did they go through the normal procedures? Did they go through immigration? And if they've served their prison terms, why are they kept in a maximum correctional facility? So there were many aspects of this case that were concerned based both from a Swazi's in-country point of view, but also from the point of view of the persons themselves that have been flown into the country in such a manner.
And we'll get to the persons or the nationals which Swaziland received. I remember initially it was said that the Prime Minister himself admitted that he had no knowledge of this deal. Has he come out to say any different? Has this in any way swayed the court, or was this purely based on a technicality? Because I understand that the court ruled that you as organization who brought the case had no legal standing to do so.
The strategy adopted by the state and the Prime Minister was that they would not file answering papers that would shed light on their position and posture on this. What we have were simply reactional statements from the spokesman from the cabinet, who then acknowledged the agreement with the United States government, and then went on to embellish how this was good for the country, the relationships. But we haven't had anything substantive coming from the office of the Prime Minister. The court did not deal with the substantive issue here, which is the violation of the Constitution, or the fact that eventually the terms of the agreement started making rounds publicly. What the court simply did is that it went with the argument that was raised by the state, which was to say, in terms of our law, we cannot bring actions in court unless we have a substantial and direct interest in the matter. We should be personally affected by this decision. And the fact that what we were doing was what our Constitution calls upon the king, the government, and every Swazi to promote, uphold, and defend the Constitution when it is violated. Our courts shied away from dealing with that and simply relied on the fact that we needed to prove how we were personally and directly affected by this decision.
And the question then becomes, if we talk about constitutionalism, surely parliamentary oversight is important. Transparency is important because Parliament represents the people of Eswatini, and agreements reached with international entities or states would be on behalf of the government of Eswatini, which is supposed to preside over the people of Eswatini. Is this assumption correct?
No, the assumption is correct. Like all jurisdictions, the legislature must play its role. That is the expectation. And in all fairness, with regards to this issue, one of the pleadings, one of the attachments that we filed in court were many recordings from Parliament where members of Parliament were questioning this deal, where they wanted merit or wanted to find out how it came about, what its implications were on the country. And the responses from cabinet at the time were next to nothing. They were silent. But you could read that members of Parliament were asking these questions, and it fell on deaf ears. It is unfortunate, though, that our court sort of swayed away and has let the matter run without dealing with the real substance of this case, which in fact would, also assist members of Parliament, because for whatever reasons they found themselves in the predicament we all found ourselves at the time. So this case would have actually given that opportunity to have them even assert the responsibility that they have in terms of the Constitution.
And I mean, we are seeing an evolution, a change, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere on, whether it be immigration laws or refugee laws. What did you as organizations say put to the court in terms of the 1951 Refugee Convention and how it impacts on Swaziland?
That this was part of why we in a specific prayer we wanted we were praying that the state should actually state before court how these individuals were brought into the country, what documentation could be brought before, could be brought openly, publicly, to explain how these individuals end up in the country. It was precisely on that point. Because, the reality and the sad aspect of this is, to date, there's nothing that is said about how these individuals got into the country, whether they complied with any of the laws nationally or internationally with regards bringing them into the country. We highlighted these issues in our pleadings, and we were hoping that we would at least get some debate or vent these issues in our court so that we would highlight how compliance is important to ensure that we have them protected. And not only the deportees, by the way, but even us as Swazis, because it is quite a concerning reality to see that this could happen to a person that is from another country, in fact, another continent, who might end up in a jurisdiction that they have never been to without proper compliance with immigration laws.
And was there discussion on what the legal risks are of Eswatini becoming a processing hub for US deportees who have very little knowledge you have, biological, cultural, or even ancestral, ties to Eswatini?
Oh, there's none. There's literally none. This case became the one option where this issue itself was being debated and discussed. We are a nation that projects itself as a nation that talks and discusses issues. But I tell you, to date, there is such secrecy around this deal and its implication on the country and what Swaziland has placed itself in, such that we are still all in the dark. There's nothing to say. I mean, you could read it, even in the approach that was taken by the state. They simply chose not to file an answering affidavit so they could avoid bringing substance or information that relates to this deal. So we are still stuck. We are caught in the dark around what the terms and the conditions are.
And I want to talk about the terms and the conditions and also the geopolitical, impact of this deal. So Swaziland, we understand, is getting millions of US dollars in aid, but is there even a hint of clarity as to what that money is in exchange for? If Swaziland is the recipient of nationals from Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, Yemen, what is it meant to do with those people who were convicted in the United States, but we understand have served their term? What are they coming to Swaziland to do?
Look, to be honest, one is in the dark. But from what we see, they are being kept, and according to the government spokesperson, they are being kept pending to their being repatriated to their countries of origin. They give the impression that our government is in talks and discussions with the different countries of origin, that after a period that is unknown, these individuals will then be sent to their countries of origin. As to whether that is in fact what is happening, we do not know. And you mentioned that Swaziland is getting foreign aid. From what we have seen of the agreement that is eventually being circulated, although not formally, is that it only speaks about 5 million US dollars, but in cash. It doesn't say this is aid. It doesn't say anything that one can hold on. And worse, the agreement seems to be speaking about 160 individuals that are coming into the country. And this we find out way into the case. At the time when we filed the case, we only had 5 individuals, and subsequently an additional 10 was brought into the country. And so this is why it is important for us to get to the meat of this discussion, so that if there is an agreement where there are individuals that were brought into the country for $5 million and the country will keep 160 people coming from wherever, the country ought to know that, yes, we are receiving $5 million, and where is that money going? And where are these 160 individuals going to be kept when we have correctional facilities already complaining about overcrowding?
Just a quick and final question. Where does this leave the people of Eswatini? Firstly, their faith in the judiciary, even though it is meant to be independent, but I understand that some of the appointments would be either encouraged by or approved by the monarch, and civilians' right to information and the transparency of executive powers. Is this case emblematic of what Amaswati can expect from the judiciary going forward?
Our sad reality is the recent past of Swaziland is that we have been a country that has been ruled under decree from 1973. And the advent of the Constitution in the year 2005 sought to bring an end to that. People will refer to a draconian era. But as to whether we've actually managed to overcome that period as a country still remains a debate. And semblance of that are seen in how decisions are made that influence the ordinary lives of Emaswati. And part of it is this. The independence of the judiciary is always in question. There's been many complaints about it, and people have decried it. The approach to litigation in Swaziland has always been that of avoidance. If the state could avoid dealing with substantive matters by simply raising technical points, the courts will avoid dealing with the substantive issues by simply dealing with the technical arguments so that the substantive matters are not dealt with. We hoped that by affirming Section 2 sub 2 of the Constitution, which gives and empowers Emaswati to uphold and defend the Constitution, the court would hear us. And the court has chosen not to. But this is not a loss to us, by the way. It gives us the opportunity to highlight the challenges that Emaswati are facing with regards protecting and promoting the Constitution and the rights to Emaswati and everyone who happens to be in this jurisdiction.
Mzandile, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Mzandile B. Masuku is the Executive Director of the Swaziland Litigation Center, which, among other organizations, had taken the matter to court. And we're talking about that third country deportee agreement that the U.S. has with the Kingdom of Eswatini, which the people say they are none the wiser, not only of the details, how many people are coming and why.
Hi there. Do you want to elevate your business and give it a voice in South Africa and Africa as a whole? Well, in that case, let Channel Africa make this a possibility. Channel Africa is willing to advertise your business for as little as 30,000 rands or $1,719.18. To get access to these great rates, send all requests to mukwenata@SABC. That's MOKOENATA@SABC. Channel Africa, the African perspective. When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
At 27 minutes to 10, we continue with regional and international news, current affairs, political and environmental developments. This time we talk about soldiers and swarms of snowplowers who are continuing the battle to clear record-breaking snowfalls in Japan, which have left 35 people dead and nearly 400 injured. The blizzards have buried some northern and western cities as the bitter conditions threaten to dent turnout for the country's general elections on Sunday. Troops from the country's self-defense forces are attempting to clear a nearly 2-meter pileup of snow in the cities, such as Mori, as the most snow seen in 4 decades is recorded. For a look at what is causing these extreme weather conditions, we're joined now on the line by Professor of Climate Change, Food Systems and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Tafadzwa Mabaudi. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
I mean, it was just quite surprising, at least certainly for me, to hear that 35 people have died as a result of record snowfall in Japan. Can you just tell us a little bit more about these reports, the heavy snowfalls in Japan, and just how peculiar they are, if at all?
So most of the people that have died, reports are indicating that most has been due to falling, people falling off their roofs while trying to remove snow from the roofs. So that has been most of it, and a few where they've been reported cardiac arrests due to the snowfall. The snow itself is not unusual in terms of snow occurring at this time of the year, but what is unusual is that it is quite heavy. So snow on its own is not unusual, but what is unusual is the amount of snow that has fallen at this time of the year. And this is mostly being attributed to a cold air mass that has lingered over the Japanese archipelago, but mostly also the fact that cold air mass, as it moved across the Sea of Japan, the moisture and the warmness above the sea created the conditions for heavy snowfall, which is being experienced.
So, has the country ever seen snowfall of this levels? And I'm just trying to understand, was there infrastructure that would have prevented scenes such as this, people having to move to their rooftops to try and, avoid the heavy snowfall and just be able to leave their residence?
So they haven't received this much snowfall, as you mentioned. I think the last, it's breaking a 40-year record. So that's 4 decades where they've not seen this kind of snowfall. But what we do know is Japan, being prone to a lot of weather extremes such as floods and tsunamis, do have very advanced early warning systems, very advanced disaster response and early action systems. But having those systems in place does not then take away the reality that, these events can still happen. The only benefit that comes from that is the limited number of deaths. So the deaths are quite low in relative to the extent of snowfall and the disaster that has happened. And also, if you look at the response that the Japanese government has been able to marshal in terms of coming in to assist communities and villages, as you mentioned at the beginning, the army being deployed to assist with clearing the snow, most of the main infrastructure has remained intact, so there haven't been major infrastructure failures, just a bit on the electricity and so forth, which is typical under heavy snowfall.
And I want to talk about that heavy snowfalls that occurred days before we saw the extreme weather conditions in terms of the storms, and just in terms of climate change, the increase in intensity of snowstorms. How do rapid snow accumulations like these relate to the broader changes in atmospheric moisture as well as temperature gradients driven by global warming?
So the linkage, at this time we cannot say that this is caused by climate change per se, because there has to be a proper attribution study. But speaking generally, what climate change is doing, or when we speak about it as global warming, is it means that with a warmer climate, you've got more energy in the climate or in the atmosphere. The surface above the seas and the oceans is warmer and there's more moisture in it. So whether it is precipitation in the form of rainfall or cyclones, that can become heavier and more intense because of the excess energy and moisture. In the case of what we are seeing in Japan, the fact that you've got a cold, dry air mass that is moving towards the land and then moving over a warm, moist sea surface, that means that it then condenses, and as it hits the mountains, then you get snowfall. But because there was a lot of moisture and warmth, then you've got more or heavier snowfall than what would be on average. So climate change, in essence, is basically supercharging weather events as we know them, hence the increase in extremes and the intensity of extremes that we are observing, whether it be snow in this case, or floods as we have experienced a lot in Africa, or drought in certain places, or temperature stress in terms of very hot days and so forth.
And these weather patterns obviously differ from region to region. And I want to delve deeper into that nuance of climate change versus global warming and what we, the ordinary person on the street, understand of it. So what we've seen here in northern Japan, the sea effect, snow that we saw, can you explain that to us? How do all of these elements interact with each other to just understand why there would be such an anomaly within 40 years?
So, as I stated in my earlier answer, the way the climate system is connected, it's one system, it's one global circulation system of air moving over the oceans, moving over land surfaces, and so forth. And we are mostly concerned with the surface temperature, the warming in the oceans. That is what influences things the most. So if you've got warmer surface temperatures above seas and oceans, if you've got more moisture than above those surfaces, then what that tends to do is we've got generally more energy in the system, to put it in a simpler term. Now, depending on where you are located in the world, that energy translates into different extremes. So those extremes in our case sometimes translate into heavy rainfall, where a normal storm or a heavy rainfall event, which normally happens in summer, then gets supercharged and it becomes more than what we usually anticipate and then overwhelms the system. In the instance of this snow, where you normally get snow, light snow, and actually the impact, the long-term impact of climate change in northern Japan is reducing the number of snow days. But then whilst the number of snow days is reducing, those few snow days can be characterized by heavier and more intense snow. Similar to how in the sub-Saharan African context, we might be seeing more rainfall variability, but then with more frequent and intense rainfall events, whilst the overall total of the rainfall might actually be low. So it's the intensity and extremeness that is mostly of concern when it comes to climate change, and how that then overwhelms the capacity of human and natural systems to absorb that event, which then translates into a disaster in the short term.
Are climate models saying that there are going to be heavy precipitation events, coming through various regions? And are we seeing countries that are employing adaptive infrastructure models that are going to help avoid these kind of occurrences of people dying unnecessarily?
So when it comes to climate change, we are more confident with temperature in terms of the predictions. So we are more certain about the temperature increases and there's less certainty on the precipitation. And the effects of climate change on precipitation are going to be quite variable across different regions. So there are regions that are going to see more drought and the droughts intensifying. There are regions that are going to see more floods and the floods intensifying. There are regions that are going to see greater variability in terms of shifting of the seasons, when the rainfall would start and when it would end. And then when it comes to things like snow, there are in many areas, they are going to experience reduced or fewer snow days and melting of the snow, which is a global concern, but then also an increase in snowstorms and heavy downpours of snow, as has been witnessed right now in Japan. So it's going to be variable across different regions of the world. And of course, then how it translates from being an extreme to a disaster then depends on the level of preparedness within the particular locality and whether actually these things happen in areas where people reside. Because you can have a storm that happens in the desert where there are no people, where there's no infrastructure. It then doesn't translate into a disaster because there's no harm to people and infrastructure. But if it occurs over a region where there are people, then the risks are different. If in that particular region, the levels of preparedness are low and the ability to take action to mitigate the impact is low, then the impact is going to be high because the levels of vulnerability are high. Certain countries that are richer or more well endowed have better resources to be able to adapt. Countries such as Japan have anticipated and have been aware and have made investments not only in their infrastructure, but in things such as their early warnings, their disaster risk management. So they are better able to respond to these challenges. Then you've got poorer countries in places like Africa, where there isn't enough money and resources to help with adaptation efforts. Therefore, the levels of vulnerability remain high and are getting higher by the day, which then means the impact of similar events happening then translate into large-scale disasters, mostly because of the high vulnerability and low adaptive capacity.
Okay. Professor, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights with us. Much appreciated. Professor of Climate Change, Food Systems and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Tafazwa Mabaudi, brings the time to 14 minutes to 9. And let's take a sneak preview into what's coming up on the Wednesday edition of African Diary. Sheila and Kumana in the studio with us. Hello there.
Hello, ma'am. Love and relationships is what we're focusing on. So in the first hour, we're going to be speaking to Tsepiso Makwetla, who's a pioneer in TV and broadcasting. And she's also the author of Intimate to You, Your Relationship Pocket. And this book is launching tomorrow, so we are really excited about that. We're going to be talking all things intimacy in the first hour. Then in the second hour of the show, we extend the conversation around intimacy and look at more of the connection aspect of intimacy. And we're going to be doing this with relationship and life coach. That is Paulo Mendes.
What do you regard as intimacy?
It's multifaceted. It's multi-layered, right? So, of course, there's a physical intimacy with your partner. There is your spiritual intimacy, right? There is your mental intimacy, I think, is also something to consider as well. And I think when you speak about the mental, it also just dabbles in the connection point between you and your special someone.
Do you regard somebody giving you information which may appear personal, private, as an indication of intimacy?
Not always.
But how do you draw the distinction? Just as a matter of curiosity.
I think I let the connection simmer until they've shown me that this is how they become intimate with someone. So I can't rule it off from the onset and be like, oh, you probably told somebody else this. So you observe them in settings. You observe them with people that they call close. You know, what are the proximities that you draw? And then that tells me, oh, that was very personal. So you're entrusting yourself to me. Some people they share everything with everyone. And you think you're special and then not so much.
Okay, we'll have another longer discussion about this because I do have questions. Yeah. Okay, that brings the time to 12 minutes to 10. That's what's coming up on African Diaries this evening.
Be inspired. Stay informed. Channel Africa, the beauty of life. Now available anytime, anywhere with our new app.
And let's continue now with Africa World Hour. While most of us are just settling into our New Year's resolutions, world's wealthiest 1% have already finished their fair share of carbon emissions for the entire year. By the 10th of January, just 10 days into 2026, this elite group had exhausted the annual carbon budget required to keep global warming below 1.5% Celsius. This being revealed in a recent Oxfam report, which also found that while the super rich burn through their limit in days, it would take the poorest half of humanity over 3 years to emit the same amount. For more on how extreme wealth is fueling climate breakdown, we're joined now on the line by Max Lawson, the Inequality Policy and Advocacy Lead at Oxfam International. A very good evening to you, Max, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
No problem.
So I'm just looking at this and I'm just asking myself this question. What does it say about just not just the world's elite, but if they are able to do so without thought, 10 days into the year, burn through their, and I can't even say it's their share of the carbon budget or output. What does it really say about the faith we have towards carbon investment?
Well, I think it tells us that the responsibility for climate breakdown is not evenly shared. You know, the poorest people, particularly in Africa, are not responsible, and yet they're paying the price with, you know, the climate is changing, droughts, we have floods, we have such impacts of climate change all over Africa and all over the world already, but it's being caused primarily by the emissions of the richest people. And these are, you know, one great fact we have, you know, the world, I think he's definitely Nigeria's richest man, maybe Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote. He produces 16 million tons of CO2 himself. So that's the equivalent of him taking his jet and flying around the world 80,000 times. I mean, we're talking about individuals emitting more than whole countries. So rich people need to stop burning the planet and stop helping.
So they probably would argue that they are flitting across the world because they are doing their bit to contribute to the systemic risks, as in they are there at the forefront of negotiating. They are there to ensure that countries who are giving incentives and shaping global capital flows are actually held accountable. And I'm playing just devil's advocate here, but
yeah, I know.
You know, how else?
You're doing a good job.
Well, I hope by then I get hired to do so. But honestly, it just makes me wonder if we're not fools for even thinking that there is going to be some sort of accountability when talking about carbon inequality, when looking at the economic and geopolitical terms that especially poor countries often go to rich countries and say, can you at least meet these targets?
I see it in some ways more positively because for some people, you know, in the middle of the kind of global income, taking my country, in order for them to cut their emissions, you know, they struggle to insulate their homes, they might have to change their heating systems, you know, it's quite hard to change your lifestyle at that level. Whereas for these rich people, you know, if we had a tax, for instance, on luxury flying, or we banned private jets, you know, you could reduce emissions really, really quickly because these are not essential things that rich people need to do every day. You know, there's an enormous amount of waste at the top, and that could be dealt with without impacting most people's lives. Because my big worry about climate change is it's very, very hard to shift your lifestyle. For ordinary people who are struggling to pay the bills, this is about, you know, having one less yacht, one less private jet, you know, maybe flying to your private island 10 times in a year instead of 20. these are all things that should be well within the reach of the richest people.
But I'm just curious, how does this type of behavior, potentially the tens of trillions of dollars that are being spent, and I understand by mid-century, how does this kind of risk profile alter the calculus for sovereign wealth funds, including pension funds, when engaging in emerging market debt or climate-related investments? How is this rationalized when speaking with this 1%?
I think it depends who you're talking to. You have to remember that most of the super rich, 1/3 of them inherited their wealth. So these are not global capital markets. These are rich heirs to fortunes. Another third got their wealth through monopoly power, crony connections to government. These are not necessarily. These people are not necessarily flying around making decisions about the future of the planet. I would say the ones that are, if you're talking about borrowing and bond markets and the availability of capital, are not the worst behaviours. Often that you'll find the most profligate and the biggest emitters are linked, for instance, to fossil fuel firms, and they're invested in not green energy, but the opposite. They're invested in continuing to burn fossil fuels. And we see many, many of those rich people attending the climate talks, billionaires flying into the COP to defend fossil fuels is a very common thing. So it's not just about what they're doing with their money in terms of emissions, it's also about their ability to try and lobby and influence events. But I would say, to be more optimistic, there are many, many rich people who are on the other side of the fence. We have an amazing group called the Patriotic Millionaires, for instance, from all over the world who want to pay higher taxes, more action on climate change. So the rich themselves are not all the same.
And that's my point, because you do have asset allocators, you do have institutional investors who would advise their clients on how to recalibrate their portfolios. How would they get it right?
Well, I think there's a limit to voluntary action, because I think we've seen in capital markets when firms try and go ahead, try and change their portfolios to be more about green energy, they get punished by their shareholders because they're not delivering the same profits, the same return that an investment in fossil fuel is, for instance. So we need to see the kind of regulation, the structural shift in the market that will make it effectively a stranded asset. It just won't be worth investing in that new coal-fired power station or that new oil refinery, and you manage to shift the whole incentive structure. So I think there is a limit. I do think there are some powerful people who make important decisions, and many of them are very rich, but I do think the main problem with investments is a structural one and a regulatory one that would make fossil fuels effectively not a good investment.
So the structural shifts that have been called for, especially at these COP conferences, what should be at the center of those talks this year? I mean, there have been all kinds of suggestions about luxury tax, wealth tax, radical green overhaul of investment regulations. But half the time it is just talk about a just transition. And it almost seems like the can seems to be kicked down the road with every year, with every talk. So what should be the focus this year? If we're saying 10 years in already, we have surpassed 10 days, it is really, for me, it's quite mind-blowing.
It is. The richest people on earth would get through their share for the year in just 10 days. And I think the reason we highlight that fact is because we think that climate policy, if it's not going to be kicking the can down the road or just talk or just hot air, climate policies at national level need to focus on making the richest polluters pay, because I think we've got a problem, particularly here in Europe and to some extent in the US, where there's a backlash against climate policies from ordinary people because they feel like they're struggling to pay the bills, they're struggling to heat their homes, to get energy. Why should they pay more because of climate change? I think we need to change the whole narrative and realise that not everyone is equally responsible for this problem. We need to focus the efforts with those with the most responsibility in the broadest shoulders. So it should be taxes on luxury travel. if you fly 10 or 20 times a year, you should pay heavy penalties for doing that. That kind of thing is what needs to happen.
And what would be the role of international financial institutions in just the pressures, the political pressures that this might exert on them so that they can influence a future climate finance architecture?
If you're talking about like the World Bank or the IMF, then I think those institutions need to stop their love affair with private finance and the market and really invest more in public solutions. So that's public energy, public transport. Those are the things that we know matter for ordinary people. And the idea that there's going to be some magic win-win solution where some shareholder somewhere can make a huge profit out of delivering green energy for South Africa, I mean, that can happen. You can have situations where it's worthwhile, but I think really governments need to be the prime movers. They need to be investing in the kind of public infrastructure that will transform an economy. And we've seen that happen. We're seeing that happen in countries all over the world, notably, most notably, and perhaps most optimistically in China, where you're seeing this huge explosion in renewable energy driven by government action, not by the private sector.
Max, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Much appreciated. Max Lawson, the Inequality Policy and Advocacy Lead at Oxfam International, just speaking about that report, as we mentioned, that 1%, the richest people in the world, blowing through their carbon budget in just 10 days coming into 2026. And that brings the time to exactly 10 o'clock. That's how we come to the end of Africa World Hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Up next is Sheila Ndukumana. Do enjoy your viewing and your listening here on Channel Africa.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet.